Hello. We're continuing our study in 2 Kings tonight. We're going to be in 2 Kings chapter 19. As you know, chapters 18 and 19 really form a literary unit. There's been much discussions among scholars and historians exactly how many invasions by Sennacherib are mentioned here. We know that the capital Samaria, the northern 10 tribes, fell in 722. Now, there's been some conjecture. It seems that from all the historical evidence we can find that is corroborated by the Assyrian documents, that the date for this invasion involving Hezekiah and the city of Jerusalem is 701 BC. But that causes a major problem back here in chapter 18, verse 13, where it says the 14th year of Hezekiah. That very same historical reference is mentioned in Isaiah chapter 36, verse 1. But folks, that date is just not the one that seems to be accurate. We don't know if a scribe has put the wrong date in here and it was copied wrong. It just will not fit historically. Some have assumed because of that we're dealing with two different invasions. One that runs from chapter 18, verse 17 to chapter 19:8, and one that begins in 19:8 and runs to verse 35. It seems to me it's one account, not two accounts of the same invasion, but simply one invasion in two different aspects. The historical problems, the number problems in the book of Kings and Chronicles is horrendous. I wish it wasn't there, but it is, and we simply have to deal with that. The parallel for this in Isaiah, of course, is Isaiah 36 and 37, and you might want to look at that as a parallel. Now let's look, if we could, at the text. And when Hezekiah heard it, he tore his clothes and covered himself with sackcloth and entered into the house of the Lord. It's obvious there should not be a chapter division between 18 and 19 because the message that he's going to get so upset about is brought to him by his representatives who have just met with the Assyrian representatives that are named in chapter 18, verse 17. Now, this tearing your clothes and covering yourself with sackcloth is, of course, two of the many signs of Hebrew mourning. And he sent Eliakim, who was over the household, and Shebna the scribe, and the elders of the priests. Now, this is an unusual phrase, the elders of the priests. We don't come across that much in the Old Testament. It must mean the older priest. It's not referring to the high priest here, but those established family leaders among the Levites that are priests. Notice it says here then that he sent this deputation to see Isaiah the prophet. Now, Isaiah, of course, has been prophesying, we know, through several different kings, beginning at the death of Uzziah, of course, Ahaz, and right on through now to Hezekiah. So he is the prophet, he is at court, he is available, and that's who they send to. And they said to him, "Thus says Hezekiah, this day is a day of distress, rebuke, and rejection, for the children have come to birth, and there is no strength to deliver." Now, that is obviously a proverb. It's a proverb about something that is a crisis that is happening, but the person doesn't have enough strength to accomplish the task of childbirth. Here is Judah faced with a crisis that she cannot handle. There's no way she can deal with this massive army outside of the gates. Perhaps Yahweh, your Elohim, will hear all the words of Rabashak. And of course, these words are blasphemous. And I think this is almost like the encounter in Daniel between Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah and Nebuchadnezzar, when Nebuchadnezzar says, "Nobody can deliver you out of my hands." And those three Hebrew boys said, "God can if he wants to." Well, this account seems to be a confrontation with Yahweh. As you know, the armies march, the name of their gods, and in their speech, they're going to say, "No God has been able to withstand us. We have crushed all the gods of the nations. Your God can't deliver you," and on and on. You might want to look at chapter 18, verse 22, chapter 18, verse 30, chapter 18, verse 34, for some of this obvious blasphemy and reproach against the covenant God of Israel. We can see it some here where it says, "Whom his master, king of Assyria," and of course that's Sennacherib, "has sent to reproach the living God." And this reproach is very, very strong. Now, they challenged God's ability to save, which meant they were really putting it in the area not of military conquest, but the conquest between deities. I want you to see very clearly that in chapter 18, verse 29 and 30, chapter 18, verses 33 through 35, in chapter 19, verses 10 and 12, that this confrontation that God is not able to deliver Jerusalem is brought up. Matter of fact, shockingly enough, in chapter 18, verse 25, one of their schemes by the Assyrian king is to say, Yahweh sent me and he gave you into my hand. He's even claiming that the Jews' own deity had rejected them. Now there is some truth that God used Assyria. It's found in Isaiah chapter 10, verse 5 and following. Assyria was the god of his anger to judge the Jews. But there is an overstatement here. Now, the living God, that's an obvious play on the word Yahweh from the Hebrew verb to be, the ever-living, only living God. I am that I am of Exodus 3:14. And will rebuke the words which the Lord your God has heard. Therefore offer a prayer for the remnant that is left. Now what remnant is he talking about? Well, we know from Assyrian documents that when Sennacherib invaded in 701 BC, that he destroyed 46 of the fortified cities of Judah. He also took into captivity 200,146 prisoners from Judah, and he even writes in his document that he had Hezekiah the king caged in Jerusalem like a bird. Maybe the remnant means those who are left in Judah. Others say no, the concept of remnant means that the Assyria at 722 under Shalmaneser had caused the northern 10 tribes to fall, and they were all taken into exile, and maybe it's just the fact that Judah is left. We're not sure which one of those aspects of remnant is referred to here. So the servants of King Hezekiah came to Isaiah, and Isaiah said to them, Thus you shall say to your master, Thus says the Lord, Do not be afraid because of the words that you have heard, with which the servants... This is not the normal term for servant here. This is a term that kind of means lackey. These minor, menial servants of the king of Assyria have blasphemed me. Now notice that. That's exactly what the problem is. They've blasphemed God, and now they're going to have to answer for that. Behold, I will put a spirit in him. Now that seems to be the best translation. That seems to be corroborated by 1 Kings 22, 19 through 23, about the spirit that came before the Lord and was a lying spirit in the mouth of the prophets. Others go back to 1 Samuel 16, verses 14 and 15, the idea about the evil spirit of the Lord came upon Saul. Now the King James has, and I will blast him. There is a possibility the word blast is true. It's from the Septuagint, the Greek translation, not the Masoretic text. But there seems to be a reference to this in Exodus 15:8. And so blast could be the blasting of killing his soldiers, that kind of thing. And I will make him return to his own land. He shall hear a rumor. Now what is this rumor? There have been several possibilities about this rumor. Some say it's a reference to the death of his army found in verses 36 and 37. Others say it refers to the fact that there's a rebellion back home. We know from verse 35 of this very chapter that he's going to be killed while he's worshiping by 2 of his own sons. So maybe there was a rebellion. Others say no, it seems to refer to verse 9 that this king of Ethiopia is coming out to battle with him. We're not exactly sure which of those three or what other suggestions might be, but God made his heart to melt as he had done the Canaanite peoples during the conquest of Joshua. And he'll return to his own land. And I will make him fall by the sword in his own land. And again, you might want to see verse 35, I believe. No, verse 36 and 37, and particularly verse 37, where it mentions he was killed by his own sons. About 20 years later now, and this is another reason why some say that there was 2 invasions, one in 701, but one later one that we have no record of, even in the Assyrian documents, to make this prophecy be more to the time it actually happened. Verse 8, And Rabshakeh returned and found the king of Assyria fighting against Libnah. We're not exactly sure where Libnah is. He had apparently destroyed Lachish, another fortified town, not too far from Jerusalem, and he had moved to Libnah. And when he heard them saying, now, I'm not exactly sure how to pronounce this Ethiopian king. He was a very strong king, a very able king. Matter of fact, his brother was on the throne of Egypt. We think this man was the strong king, and possibly his brother was simply a puppet king of him. Later on, he'll come to the throne of Egypt himself. as we see in Isaiah 37:9. So really the Egyptian army, all of those armies of the Nile River were coming up to stop the king of Assyria from invading Egypt, which he, of course, tried to do. Behold, he has come out to fight against you. He has sent messengers again to Hezekiah, saying. Now, what the king is going to say is, don't you trust in the Egyptian army. That's what Isaiah had been telling Hezekiah. Don't trust in the Egyptians. They can't help you. Trust in God. He can help you. Now, look at verse 10. Boy, this is blasphemous. And you shall say to Hezekiah, king of Judah, do not let your God in whom you trust deceive you. Now, that's very similar to verse 30 over here in chapter 18. Look at that, verse 18. Chapter 18, verse 30. Nor let Hezekiah make you trust in the Lord, saying, the Lord will surely deliver us, and this city shall not be given into the hand of the king of Assyria. Well, this is reverse psychology. He's telling Hezekiah, don't trust in the Lord. No God has ever delivered their people from my hand. You're doomed, surrender. Well, boy, that's the confrontation of God right there. He's confronted the wrong person. Behold, you have heard what the king of Assyria has done to all the lands, destroying them completely. And so will you be spared? Kind of sarcasm. Did the gods of those nations which my father destroyed deliver them? And there's true, for about 3 successive rulers, every war that Assyria got in, she just leveled their adversaries. The Bible says that God gave her the ability to do that. Deliver them. And here's a series of towns, most of these and countries, most of these are at the headwaters of the Euphrates River, north of Syria, on the coast, the head of the Tigris and the Euphrates, in that area right there. And when Hezekiah took the letter from the hand of the messengers. Now some say this is a separate deal. First we have the message that they spoke verbally to his messengers on the wall. But here we have a written letter. There's been much speculation of exactly how this worked. We simply do not know. We just need to be less speculative here because we're not sure exactly what happened. Some say the king left and came back again. After he went out to fight the Egyptian army, he wrote a letter to Hezekiah and said, don't think this is going to get you off the hook, guy. Maybe that's the letter that we're talked about here. It says he spread it out before the Lord. Now, 2 possibilities. He spread the letter out before the Lord, emphasizing that the Lord read what this man said about you. Or possibly it may refer to Hezekiah spreading his hands to God, which is a normal thing of Jewish prayer, and we find that in the next verse. Hezekiah prays a very theological prayer here. It's wonderful. And Hezekiah prayed before the Lord and said, O Yahweh, the Elohim of Israel, who art enthroned above the cherubim. Oh, that's beautiful. Of course, the top of the Ark of the Covenant, there's a mercy seat where the blood was sprinkled once a year on the Day of Atonement by the high priest to cover the sins of the people. God symbolically dwelt between the wings of those cherubim. We learn from 1 Kings 6, 23 through 28, that Solomon had made huge cherubim, 10 cubits tall, in the Holy of Holies. This mercy seat is described in Exodus chapter 25, verse 22, and a reference to these cherubim are found in 1 Samuel 4:4 and 2 Samuel 6:2 and Psalms 80 verse 1 and Psalms 99 verse 1. Now he's going to say 4 things about God. Number 1, the God, thou alone, of all the nations of the earth, thou hast made heaven and earth. Notice what he's saying. You are the only God. You alone, of all the kingdoms of the earth. What a universal kind of element there, that God's the God of all the nations. And finally, you're the creator of the earth. This is monotheism in a very wonderful way. Incline your ear, O Lord. Open thine eyes, O Lord, and see and listen to the words of Sennacherib, which he has sent to reproach the living God. That's exactly what he did. You can see that reproach is mentioned earlier back over here in verse 4, and we see it completely in the words of these messengers, both in chapter 18 and in this letter of chapter 19. Now, and they have, verse 17, truly, O Lord, the king of Assyria has devastated the nations and the land. Well, that's true. There had been a series of successful military campaigns. No army could stand before him. But they hadn't met Yahweh yet. They hadn't met the Creator, Redeemer, God of the universe. They have cast their gods into fire, and they were not gods, but the work of men's hands, of wood and stone, so they have destroyed them. I think this idea of men making something with their hands and then bowing down and worship them is so ridiculous. You might want to see Isaiah 42:17, Isaiah 44:9 through 20, classic passage, Isaiah 46:6 and 7 about these idols. And we know from Assyrian documents they saved the gold and precious idols with stones on them and that, took them to their temple as kind of a trophy of their victory over these gods. But the lesser gods, the gods the people had in their homes, the bronze gods, the wood gods, they just destroyed all them, burnt them. This fits the Assyrian documents quite well. But now, O Lord, our God, I pray deliver us from his hand, that all the kings on the earth may know that thou alone, O Yahweh, art God. Wow, that's the purpose of Israel, is to reveal God to the world. Exodus 19:5 and 6, a kingdom of priests. And here's an example of that all the world may know. Let me give you some other parallels of this very, very significant theological truth, that Israel was meant to reveal God to all the world. You might want to see Exodus 19:5 and 6. You might want to see Joshua 4:24, 1 Samuel 17:46, and 1 Kings 8:60. All reveal this idea of Israel as a kingdom of priests to reach the world. Then Isaiah, son of Amoz, sent to Hezekiah, saying, Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, because you have prayed to me about Sennacherib. Notice that the prayers of Hezekiah are effective. We believe that our prayers do change God. That's why we believe in intercessory prayer. I think God has limited himself to the prayers of his children. We have not because we've asked not. God says, because, Hezekiah, you trusted me in the face of this threat. In the midst of your fear, you trusted me. I will deliver you. We need to hear that, don't we? And here in verse 21 and following through 28 is kind of a poetic section. I believe that verses 21 through 24 and verses 25 through 28 are written to the king of Assyria. In verses 21 and 22, Israel, really Judah, Jerusalem, laughs at the invasion. Verses 23 and 24, the Assyrian king brags about his power. And then in verse 25 through 28, God's sovereign statement that he'll do what he wants to do in deliverance is made. And here it is. This is the word the Lord has spoken against him. She has despised you and mocked you, the virgin daughter of Zion. And of course, this is a personification of Jerusalem, that she laughs at your threats because she has trust in God. She has shaken her head behind you. We learned from Psalms 22:7, this was a sign of derision. Now in verse 22, look at this. Whom you have reproached and blasphemed, against whom you have raised your voice, and haughtily lifted up your eyes. This idea of the braggadociousness of this king can be seen in verse 4, verse 6, verse 10, verse 27 and 28. Matter of fact, I really believe that verse 23 through 24 is very similar to the bragging, ostentatious words of the king of Babylon in Isaiah 14 and the king of Tyre in Ezekiel 28, that both are used as examples for Satan's pride. And we see that same kind of thing here. Matter of fact, in verse 23, I really think it's a reference to that mystery mountain in the far north where the gods live, that this king, like the king of Babylon, the king of Tyre, wanted to ascend and be like God himself. And that there may be a kind of an undercurrent of that in this chapter. Others say no. What it really is, that this king's going to say, I'm going to overcome mountains, verse 23. I'm going to overcome forest, verse 23. I'm going to overcome rivers, verse 24. No natural barrier can stop me, this king says. I'm going to overcome all my enemies. And there's the braggadociousness there. Now in verse 25 and following, have you not heard? Long ago I did it. From ancient times I planned it. God's saying, hey, you think you're so hot. I'm the one that called you. I'm the one that empowered you. I'm the one allowed your victories. And of course, Isaiah chapter 10, verse 5 and following exactly says it, that God used Assyria as his means of judging his people. Verse 26, therefore the inhabitants were short of strength. And God gave them a fear of the Syrians. They were dismayed and put to shame. They were as vegetation of the field. This is a very common biblical metaphor of the grass of the field being very transitory and fleeting and very frail, but God being eternal. You might want to see Isaiah 40, verses 6 and 8 for this same metaphor. Now, notice in verse 27 it says, I know your sitting downs, your going outs, and your coming ins. Oh, this is very similar to the central trust of Psalms 139, that all of our lives are an open book to God. God says, I know you, king of Assyria. I know your nation. I'm the one that's done this for you and not yourself. Then in the latter part of verse 27, in the first part of verse 28, God says, and you're raging against me because you're raging against me. God knew this king, what he was saying. This king was acting so pompous and braggadocious and blaspheming God. Now, because of your arrogance has come up to my ears, therefore I will put a hook in your nose and put my bridle in your lips. Now this is both literal and figurative. We know from some of the pictures we've seen on the excavations of both Assyria and Babylon that particularly Assyria used to bring important people before the king with hooks in their nose, kind of a nose ring through the cartilage here, or hooks in their lower lips, and drag these people for the king. Now what it says here is God's going to do that to you, Sennacherib. You did it to others, now God will do it to you. A few references of this nose ring and lip hook can be seen in 2 Chronicles 33:11, Ezekiel 29:4, and Ezekiel 38:4. If you want to see about the lower lip being a place where the hook is put, you might want to see Isaiah 30, verse 28. And you will go back the way you came, which is exactly true. He came through the coastal road called the Sheplah, and he'll go back exactly that same way without ever getting close to Jerusalem. And then it shall be a sign for you. Now here, Isaiah is doing the very same thing to Hezekiah that he had done earlier to Ahaz. This is very similar to the sign of the young woman shall conceive of Isaiah 11, and then of course the same thing in Isaiah 9 and 7 about this special child that's going to be born. God's going to give Hezekiah a sign. It's an agricultural sign about that they will be able to have secure crops, meaning the Assyrians will be gone and will not come back. We know that this king did retreat back to his country because of what's going to happen in verse 35, and he will make no more military campaign for 5 years into Palestine. Now notice it continues then when it says, and the surviving remnant of the house of Judah shall again take root downward and bear fruit upward. Here's a metaphor for you're going to be a sturdy, fruitful vine, which has always been a symbol of Israel. Notice in verse 31, for out of Jerusalem shall go forth a remnant, and out of Mount Zion survivors, for the zeal of the Lord shall perform this. Now you might want to see this same idea of zeal, which means a love word. It's almost the word jealousy in Isaiah 9:7 and Isaiah 37:32. God's love, not their spirituality, will bring this promise to pass. Therefore says the Lord concerning the king of Assyria, he shall not come to this city, nor shoot an arrow there, neither shall he come before it with shield or throw a mound up against it. No siege, no warfare close to it. These mounds were put up against the wall so their rams could get up higher on the wall where it was weaker and knock a hole in it. None of that will happen. By the way, he came, he shall return, and he shall not come to this city, declares the Lord. For I will defend this city to save it for my own sake and for my servant David. Great parallel for this is 1 Kings 11:13. God's going to do it first because of his namesake's involved in revealing himself to the world, and secondly because of his covenant promises to Abraham and uniquely to David also, found in 2 Samuel chapter 7. Then it happened that night that the angel of the Lord, notice the death angel is not a servant of the evil one, he's a servant of God. This is much like the last plague of the Exodus, the death of the firstborn. The angel of the Lord went out and struck 185,000 in the Assyrian camp. We learn from Herodotus that an Egyptian tradition says that field mice invaded the Assyrian camp. Now the Assyrian camp was not close to Jerusalem. Some say it was in Libnah, which is in the area of Goshen, we think, in the Nile Delta region. Others say it was way up north, somewhere beyond Galilee. We're not sure exactly where his major camp was. But they say rats came in and destroyed all their weapons, and maybe they got bubonic plague from the fleas on the rats. That's the Egyptian legend connected with this destruction of all this army. And the men rose early in the morning. Behold, all of them were dead. It wasn't a sickness that took them gradually. It was something that happened overnight. 185,000 dead. So Sennacherib, king of Assyria, departed and returned home and lived at Nineveh. Many believe he was the first one to make Nineveh, not the capital, but his permanent residence. And of course, Nineveh is on the Tigris River, somewhere close to where it makes the bend to the north. In the area, Media is just to the northeast of this. And it came about as he was worshiping the house of Nisroch, his god. We have no example of this name anywhere in the Assyrian records of a deity named Nisroch. Now, Josephus changes the name slightly, and it may be a form of the god Asher, which was the chief god of the Assyrians. But Josephus also tells us this was the name of the temple, not the deity itself. We know from Assyrian documents that the Assyrians named their temples as well as their deities, and this may be the name of a temple that we just don't know. And notice these, the next two men. Now, not every manuscript, but the Septuagint adds, and his 2 sons killed him. We do know from Assyrian documents that Esarhaddon, which is the successor to Sennacherib, one of his sons, had to fight a battle with another one of his sons in the northern Tigris area in the early part of his reign. So that seems to fit real well. And Esarhaddon is mentioned there. He reigned from 681 to 669 and was another very strong king. Okay. Well, I think this chapter has been very significant. I want to say to you again, I hope you'll look at all the historical commentaries you have about how many invasions this is. It seemed to me it's just one, with maybe an interlude in it because of this Egyptian army that came out in the field. But Hezekiah couldn't trust in the Egyptians. He had to trust in God. The reason that God so devastated the Assyrian army is because of the pompous braggadociousness of their king that even blasphemed deity and said, your God can't deliver you. Look at all the nations I've destroyed and all their gods. Why would your God be different? Friend, it's because it's the only God. It's the Redeemer God. It's the God of Israel, the Holy One of Israel. And we see it here. Well, I've really enjoyed being with you, and I'll see you again, same time, same place, next week. God bless you.